So what is Bootstrap? It's an open source framework for building web apps. Much of it is based on CSS and Sass. It uses JavaScript for its own components, and it focuses on being modular as well as skinnable. It doesn't have its own look and feel to allow you to make the changes to make it look like your website, not like a generic Bootstrap site. And it has support for 80% of the common metaphors that most websites need. Let's add it to the project. So let's start by adding Bootstrap to our project and to our layout. To get us started with Bootstrap, we're going to need to bring in the Bootstrap assets, the JavaScript and the CSS files. We're going to do this using libman like we've done before. So we're going to go over from add to client-side library. And again, I'm going to continue to use unpackage, though. You can use whichever one you want. And when I type in Bootstrap, you can see there's a few related Bootstrap packages, but we're going to pick the one that just is called Bootstrap. And currently that's 4.6. Just like before, we're going to only pick the things in the dist folder. Make sure that they're going to the lib folder in Bootstrap and press install. Once that's done, inside our lib folder will now be the Bootstrap assets, just like we saw before. And here at the top of the project, we're going to need to put Bootstrap before our own site CSS. This is going to allow us to override some of the CSS in our own site.css. Again, because the order matters in CSS, where the later imported one can overwrite the earlier one, that's where we're going to want it. So let's open up Bootstrap CSS, and let's just take the Bootstrap CSS. That's a CSS file that's going to cover the whole project. We brought that in. And let's go to the bottom, and we're going to want to do the same thing with the JavaScript. Now the difference here is that Bootstrap relies on jQuery, so we're going to want to sandwich that before our index.js, but after jQuery. Let's go ahead and get the min version, since we're not going to really debug Bootstrap. And in fact, we can do the same thing for the CSS down here, and just go ahead and get the min version. You see, we can get tooltips about the right file when we just type it in as well. By just including the CSS and the JavaScript, we're not getting a big change to our website yet. The one noticeable change is the fonts. Bootstrap does have a default font that you could then change if you'd like, but we've inherited that font in our project here. Now there's some CSS here that is specific to what we're trying to do, and by adopting Bootstrap, we're going to want to use its elements to build the look and feel of our web project. So the first thing we want to do is go eliminate all of the CSS we've built so far. So back in our project, let's close that lib folder because we've already gotten the things from Bootstrap. But we're going to open up our CSS file. And we're just going to select all and comment it out. We'll come back and maybe turn some of these on, but some of the things we're doing with this default CSS, we're actually going to leverage Bootstrap instead. So let's make that change. And back in the browser, we'll see the default properties as Bootstrap has them before we've done anything to it. Now notice that all of this is stuck to the left-hand side of the page, and this isn't really giving us an attractive look and feel. So let's add some basics to our layout to start structuring our web page. So back in Visual Studio, we're going to start by thinking about our page in sections. We have a header here. We have the main section here, and then we have this footer. So for our header, I'm just going to add a class here that says container. And you'll notice that when we start dealing with this, you'll see a small blue symbol in the IntelliSense to indicate that that is a Bootstrap class, not one that we've defined separately. By adding container to the header, we can see that we're now moving this off from the edge and creating a section on the page. Let's do the same thing for all three. And for the footer, I'm actually going to wrap the copyright in its own div. And I'll add container again. And what we'll see is we're actually creating a container that is not the full width of the page. Let's show you what that looks like. If we go back to the site.css, I'm going to move these down and we'll just start to add things here at the top. And for the header, I'm just going to say background color gray. If we show this in the browser, we'll see that our container is taking up much of the width of the page. In fact, this ends up being a responsive width because it's going to change the width depending on how wide our page is, and this is going to apply it to different responsive device types. You'll notice when we get fairly small that the width is always going to be 100%, going to be the exact width of our whole page. Back here in the layout, if we change this to a different class called Container Fluid, it's going to make it the entire width of the browser, no matter what we do. And depending on what you're doing, if you're doing sort of like a replacement for a desktop app inside the browser, Fluid is often what you're going to want. You're going to want to take as much real estate as possible. In many cases, when you're building websites, especially for consumers, you're going to want to use the simple container. And that's what we're going to actually do. If we change this back to container for a moment, and then refresh in the website, one thing you'll notice is that as the view percentage goes down, it's keeping the entire website inside and centered so that it's going to try and look its best, regardless of what the settings are in the actual browser. We'll leave it at 100% for now. And I'm going to get rid of that gray background because that's only there to sort of give you a sense of what the containers look like. Let's go ahead and get rid of that header. We'll come back and use the site CSS a little later to actually make some of these changes. We can also make some changes here to use some of the classes that are in Bootstrap to help us do some common things like class equals text center. This will, as the name suggests, simply center our copyright. We can use that in a number of different places. Even if we look at individual views, we can make those same sort of changes, like class button success. These are classes inside of Bootstrap that allows us to style this button like a Bootstrap button. So one of the things that Bootstrap doesn't try to do is replace every element with exactly what it should be. It's using classes to do that sort of design. And one thing we didn't talk about when we talked about CSS earlier is this idea, and that is a class can contain more than one class that are both applied. And Bootstrap has this philosophy of one class to say the kind of thing it is, and then dash something else to change some part of that. And so this is actually saying, make this a Bootstrap button, and then color this with the success color for Bootstrap. And we'll talk a little bit more colors in a minute. But if we now look at this page, we're getting this green button on our product form. Has a mouse over, different chains, and much more modern look. And you're going to be able to apply things across the views, not just at the layout level, because all of those Bootstrap styles and different components we're going to look at are supported across any of the Razor pages. So let's move to the top of the form, and let's make this into a more traditional header with some navigation in it. Now let's build a nav bar on the top of our page. We're going to take our website and we're going to build a bar on the top that's going to include our menu and the name of our site. We also want this to be able to be responsive so that we can show it on both larger screens like this or smaller screens like on phones. We'll handle both of those at the same time using Bootstrap. This idea that Bootstrap has is to create something called a nav bar. So we're going to change this menu here to actually just be called a nav. This is not required. It's just specifying in HTML5 terms that this is where our navigation exists. We're going to give it a class of nav bar, which is a concept directly from Bootstrap. We're also going to move this Welcome to Dutch Treat just inside the nav bar, because we want the nav bar to contain both the label for what the website is, as well as the actual menu. If we look at this again, we can see we have the Welcome to Dutch in the same line as the menu, but of course this isn't what we want the menu to look like, but we'll get there in a minute. The first thing we want to do is use a class inside the navbar called Navbar Brand. Navbar Brand is a special class, usually for the name of the website or some large piece of what the navbar is trying to show you. If we show this now, we can see that it's being sized, but we can't really see what the navbar is to see how friendly this is. So let's make the navbar actually dark. And we can do that by, in the navbar, we can do two things. We can say Navbar Dark. By saying Navbar Dark, we're actually telling it to use white text. We're telling it that we want the content of the navbar to treat it as if it were dark. And then we can use these special classes called BG- to specify different colors. Now, Bootstrap itself has some built-in standard colors like primary, secondary, etc. We're actually just going to say dark in order to make the bar itself just dark related to the theme we're looking at. Now, if we refresh, we can see that we have this dark bar at the top. Now, it's awfully tall right now, and that's because our menu itself is also tall. It's trying to contain everything into the bar, and we'll want to make this a bit smaller. So back in Visual Studio, let's wrap our actual menu in another div, and then the actual unordered list here, we're going to give it a class of navbar nav. This is essentially just telling it that we want this to represent a set of menu items. And in order to look the way we want it to, we're going to need to go to each list item here and add the class of nav item. And we'll also want to go to each link. We'll want to add the class of nav link. And let's repeat that for each one of these until we'll end up with an unordered list called navbar nav, the list items themselves being nav items, and then the links themselves being nav links. If we see this now, we can see that they have a different look and feel to them, but we can still see these are being shown top to bottom. That's because this is actually treating the menu items as if we were using them on a very small screen, trying to make them responsive so that on a small screen they will be just a list of menu items. To change this, we're going to come here to our nav itself, and we're going to add a new one that says navbar expand MD. Now, MD refers to at what breakpoint we want to expand that navbar, and in our case, we want it to be the middle size. We'll talk a little bit more about the breakpoints in a couple minutes, but we're essentially telling the navbar we want it to expand into a menu, into a drop-down menu at a certain point. And by making that change, we can now see that our items on this large screen are just left to right, but then when we go to a small screen, they're top to bottom. Now, when we're on the smaller screen, we can see that it's taking a lot of room, and that might not be what we want. And so let's actually address that. We're going to want to add in here a new button, and this button's job is to display a button when we're on a small screen to expand that. And we're going to call this with a special class called Navbar Toggler. This is a special type of button that's just going to show basically a hamburger menu and allow the user to tap it to show the menu when you're on smaller screens. We're actually going to use a span inside of it to show that hamburger icon. You could replace the span with some other context on the button that you'd want, but by using the icon, we get the simple hamburger menu. If we just show this, we'll see the hamburger menu, though it's not really displayed correctly yet. It's just being shown there. But that's by default being hidden above whatever that navbar expand is. In our case, that's medium. So we're going to need to add a couple more pieces here. We're going to want to tell the button, this is a style you're going to see a lot in Bootstrap, and that is using the data elements. In our case, it's going to be toggle, and we're going to want it to collapse an element when it's pressed. We're also going to want data target to point at what we want to show and hide. And what we want to show and hide is actually this div here that contains the whole menu. So let's add an ID here of the menu, and then in the data target, we can just give it a selector, a CSS selector, pound the menu, which says go find the item on the page called the menu. But in order to really wire this up and make it work correctly, we need some classes here on the container of our menu as well. That is Navbar Collapse, which means this is a navbar that's going to be collapsible, and then we're going to actually tell it that we want to start out collapsed unless something special actually expands it. So let's see what this actually looks like. If we refresh, we see our regular menu still, but when we make it smaller, it's actually a little smaller, we're going to see that hamburger menu on the right-hand side unless the page is too small. And when we click it, it's going to expand or contract that same number of menus that we have on the larger screens as just listed here. So we're really close to what we want. So let's talk about the Bootstrap grid system. We're going to lay out anything on our page. Bootstrap employs this idea of a 12-column grid system. 12 is a special number in that it's divisible by a lot of things. You divide it by 6 and you get essentially half. If you divide it by 4, you get thirds. You divide it by 3, you get quarters. You divide it by 2, you get sixths. So 12 ends up being a fairly magical number. And so a lot of grid systems in web development all use this idea of 12 grids. And so the Bootstrap system uses classes to find elements that are going to take X number of columns in that grid. Let me give you an example. If we gave 2 elements with column of 6, we're essentially going to get side by side 50%, 50%. That same idea, if we give 3 columns of 4, we're going to get pretty much 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Quarter, 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 quarter for column 3, and then of course column 2s would be all 6. And so you can see that the idea here is to specify how many of the columns. This can be a little confusing because the larger the number, the fewer the columns. So you should really think about it as not the number of columns, but the number of parts of the grid that it's going to take. You can really mix and match these. So if you started with a column of 9, so taking up about 75% of the page, and then you added one with column 3 that took up 25%, you don't have to have each side be perfectly even. And this way you could define something like the main blog body and then maybe a sidebar. The Bootstrap grid also has this idea of offset, so you can specify how wide something is, like in this case it's 8 columns wide, and then the offset says go ahead and move it out a number from the last column we saw. So we end up with these 2 empty units of our grid. And we can mix and match these as well, in that we can have an offset happen but after another column. It doesn't have to be only the column that begins a line. And if we have another element here that passes over the edge of the 12, or in this case has a total of 14, the grid system simply says go ahead and just wrap that to whatever the next column is. And so by using these different elements of columns and offsets, you can really define fairly complex definitions for the way you want the layout of your page to work. So Bootstrap defines 5 different grid sizes, and these are grid sizes that are going to be used based on what screen size you're using. So XL defines any screen that's 1200 pixels or wider, usually what we think of as a retina display. And then 992 or larger is what we refer to as large, and those are things like laptop screens that aren't retina displays. Then we have 768 or larger, which are usually tablet displays. Then we have less than 768, which usually indicates that we're now in the size of a phone. So small indicates something like a smartphone. And then something smaller than 576 indicates a very small phone, usually something like a flip phone or a low-resolution phone. And here you can define columns that are different for different size screens. Let's see what this looks like. So in this case, we're going to say that for a medium screen and larger, we want it to be half of the columns. But when we get down to the smallest size, where the column doesn't indicate a size, this is for the smallest of sizes, we want it to take up 12 or the entire screen. And that's pretty typical. You might also, in some cases, have many sizes indicated. That's when you really want to change the look as you hit these different breakpoints. Let's go ahead and use these grids so you can get a better sense of what we're talking about. So let's use the grid system. Back in Visual Studio, let's open up our index.cshtml, and let's use this to actually add some columns. First thing we're going to do is we're going to take our entire section here and just wrap it in a div. In this case, we're going to start with a div called row. And row basically says, get ready for us to structure some grids. And again, we'll wrap this in another div so we can tell it how wide we want this. So let's add a class called column_md6. So essentially we're saying on tablet sized and larger, let's split this and only include this on 1/2 of the page. But let's add another div here and add the same thing. So we just added some text to the second column. Let's see what this looks like in the browser now. So what we've effectively done is that this part of the page is taking up half the page, and then this new content we created here is taking up the right half of the page. But remember, I specified this for tablet size and larger by using the MD for medium. So on the largest size screens, it's taking up 1/2 and 1/2. As we make this a little smaller for tablet sized, it's still 1/2 and 1/2. But as soon as we pass that even smaller sized into the SM for small or XS, our second column has disappeared. And the reason is because we haven't specified it, it's going to end up at the bottom here. Because we didn't specify it, therefore it's going to be 12 columns wide. And on smaller devices, this is really commonly what you want. Because on smaller devices, you have more vertical space than you have horizontal space. So let's change this for a minute. And let's change these to, let's say 9 wide. And make this 3 wide. When we have done this, we're now saying that this is taking up a majority of the page, and then we have this little sidebar that contains our pieces. And so we're going to allow ourselves to really make the decisions about how these columns are structured. Let's do this one more time. Let's open up that contact page we've been building. First thing we'll want to do is wrap the entire form. So I'm just going to collapse it and then put a little div around it. And I'm going to start with just a column of 6. And I'm going to start with medium because on the smaller size screens, I'm going to want it to take full width. But for medium size screens or larger, we can go ahead and show 6. But we also want to use an offset, also of mid, of 3, and that's to push it towards the center. Again, remember we're dealing with a column size of 12. So if we take 6 and then take what's left, which is also 6, divide it by 2, so that we have that amount on each side, we'll need to push our columns over by 3. And here we can see that it has moved it over by 3, but because these aren't full width, we can't really see where this ends. So let's go ahead and wrap it one more time so we can see actually where the form starts and ends. And I'm going to do that with a class called a card. And card body is going to specify that we want it in from the card. Card is just a simple way to make a container for us. And I'm also going to add a background of light. And what that's going to do is just put a really light gray behind it so that it pops out on the screen. We can see now exactly where our form is. Later we'll make these the full width of this and so that we're not wasting space. But we can see it is centered on our page. But of course our titles right here aren't centered. Let's just make that change in our layout. Let's go ahead and find where that title is shown. Remember, we're setting the title on the view, and then the layout page is going to show whatever that title is. And so I'm just going to go ahead and center it with text center. We refresh it now. That is also centered. So next, let's go ahead and use Bootstrap's ability to style forms to make this look even better. So now let's see what Bootstrap can do to make our forms look and feel a little better. Back in that contact page, we're going to leave all of the elements in here for actually making the form work. All we're going to do is use some structure in order to allow us to change the look and feel, not the actual working. So we're going to leave the ASP4s, we're going to leave the ASP validation 4s, all of that stuff is going to stay the same. What we're going to do first is wrap up each of the logical elements here in our form into its own divider or div. So let's get rid of that BR and let's wrap the label, the input, and then the validation span all in the same div. And we're going to use a class called form group. This is just going to group our elements all together so that they know that they're a structured group. And this will change the way it'll look depending on the resolution. And this also allows us to get rid of the hard line breaks that we're using here, which can be problematic for allowing CSS to easily format our pages. So I'm going to get rid of all those, and then we'll do the same thing we did a minute ago. Form group, almost done, form group. And lastly, for the input and message we have, we're going to put that also in a form group. Even though it's not actually input elements, the form group still gives us that structure we want. And back in the browser, if we refresh, we'll see this hasn't actually changed a whole lot. It hasn't made it certainly look any better than it was. And the reason is we need to tell the inputs what kind of styling to put on them individually. So unlike when we were doing CSS and we were styling the inputs separately, we're actually going to use classes to define how we want these to look. And we do that by going to each input and adding a class called form control. In this case, I'll actually copy them so I can just add them real quick. And the same class is going to be added to the text area, even though it's not an input. It's still something that collects inputs. And you'll actually use these in similar ways when we later go ahead and use checkboxes or radio buttons. But for now, that should be a good start. And now our form is starting to look a little more polished in the way we want it. But we still have this really ugly send message. Now, if we in send message add form control, we'll actually get the styling for the form control added here. That's probably not what we really want. Instead, I'm going to just tell it that this input is styled like a button. We'll actually see these button classes are useful for a variety of different kinds of controls, not just the actual button elements, but submit buttons as well as anchor tags can be classed as buttons. So if we come back here, we get this gray, which of course is disappearing on here, but we also want to encourage people to actually send the message. So we can add another button block here for what kind of color we want. Now, there's a set number of colors in Bootstrap. There's 6 colors: danger, primary, success, warning, and default. These specify a class of colors that actually go pretty well together. For us, I'm going to use primary. Since this isn't really a sales sort of thing, I like to use success for when I'm sort of encouraging the user to go ahead and follow things. These are great on landing pages. But for this, I'm just going to say primary. And we get a nice blue button, which is part of the standard color palette. And what's interesting is later, when you want to skin the Bootstrap look and feel, you can then just go in and change the colors of primary, warning, danger, and success, and they'll change everywhere. And so it becomes a little easier to manage, making the colors of your website really match your company's look and feel. Now, just because we've styled this doesn't mean it's going to be much different. You see, we're still getting the errors like this is in email isn't enough, right? We're still getting those, but I don't really like the way they're looking right now. They're showing underneath. If we come over here, we can use those same colors for the spans. But instead of button, we can say class equals text dot, let's say, warning. And so we're now getting a color that's for the warning, or we could change to danger for more of a red. So again, the capability of the form hasn't changed. We're just changing the look and feel. Let's just come back here and add the text danger to each one of these fields. What's interesting about these spans is, of course, we're not seeing this text or the text that's part of the page until there's actually an error. And so that gives us a little more effectiveness to do what we want. And let's go ahead for our user message, even though we don't have it working yet. We'll add a class there for a text. Let's say success. So now that we have our fully styled form, let's make it work. I'll say my name, pick one of my email addresses, put a great message for me to see later, clear the form, mail sent nice and green, though we could certainly make that look a little better with some of the other classes in Bootstrap. But we can see now that we decided the functionality earlier, and now we're making decisions about the look and feel using Bootstrap or any other skinning method for our website. And that's one of the things that I get really excited about with Bootstrap, is that I can really separate those tasks. I don't have to try to get them both right at the same time. Let's talk a little bit about icons next. And now let's talk about Font Awesome and how you would bring in another library to help you make things just a little prettier. Back in the project, we're going to want to use some icons in our project. We're going to want to bring in an icon library. And you can use one of many that are out there, but I'm going to show you how to use Font Awesome as a common one. And if you go to fontawesome.com, you'll actually see ways to use these icons. There's a few different strategies, and one of these buttons will be Start for Free. We're going to use the approach of using the Css and Font Files, which is one of the options you have. Back in Visual Studio, let's go ahead and add that as a new library. Same way we've done it before with Library Manager or Libman. And I'm going to change it to Unpackage like we've done before. And I'm going to look for Fort. Font Awesome is the organization over Font Awesome, and so you see a lot of different libraries here. What we're looking for is Font Awesome Free under Font Awesome. There will be an older version that's just called Font Awesome. That's version 4 dot something. And you can still use that, but this has a larger number of icons, and I think they look a little better. So for us, we're going to choose some specific files. We're going to want the CSS files and the web fonts. For us, we don't need the SVGs or the SCSS or the LEST files or even the JavaScript files. We're just going to use CSS and then these web fonts that represent each of those icons. And they're using web fonts or SVG in this case because these are resizable. They're not images, they're vector images, so they're resizable. Go ahead and install that. This can be a little large, so you're going to want to look at this restore operation to see how long it will take. And in the output, you'll actually see Library Manager as one of those options to see the output from. And there it's starting to do the download. Most of the libraries we use are fairly small, but because of the fonts, this can take a little longer. And now that it's installed, we can see it here in the lib folder. This process may take a little longer than you might imagine because the size of some of the files in Font Awesome tend to be pretty large. We can see Font Awesome has a folder here and then Font Awesome is under it. And so let's just go to the CSS. We can decide which of these to bring in, but for us, because we don't know yet, we're just going to pick all. I'm going to grab the all.min and I'm going to put it after Bootstrap. Doesn't really need Bootstrap, but it's just the convention I've always had. Bootstrap first because it's the big design of your site, and then Font Awesome for the icons you're going to use, and then your own style sheet. Not a hard and fast rule, it's just one that I've tended to stick with. Now that we've included it in the layout, we want to start using it, and we'll use it here in the layout first. The way it's used is you specify an I tag with a class to tell it where to put in this magic icon. So for us, we're going to put it right in the Navbar brand. So if we run this project before we put it in, we want some sort of icon that represents Dutch treat here. So here in the Navbar brand, let's go ahead and just put one of those I tags, and we're going to use a class here to say what tag. And Font Awesome tags start with FA, and for us, we're going to use FAS because we want the solid icons. These are the main type of icons that are going to be supported. They have outlined icons and bolded icons and even brand icons. And then it's an FA dash for the type of icon you want. For me, I know that I want a paintbrush. You can see we're getting pretty good IntelliSense here as well. So let's say if I did paint roller first, go back and refresh Dutch treat. We can see we now have a paint roller. And there's a ton of these that you can see and search for on the Font Awesome website. But we're going to use brush here. I'm also, and almost always, will put a space in between the font and the actual text because it lays it out a little better. Go ahead and refresh that as well. And there we have the Dutch treat with the icon. Now, one of the nice things about these icons, because they're vectors, not rasters, is that as we increase the size of the page, it can get really big and still look good, right? You're not going to get any pixelization there. In some cases, we want to apply yet more classes to do some more interesting things, and we'll do some of this later in the course. Let me show you a couple of them just to sort of whet your appetite. And we come back here and we can use a couple of different ones. You can see these 1x, 2x, 4x. These are actually specifying how much smaller or larger, and they have a number of these up through 10x. So if we went ahead and said FA4x, refresh the view, we can see we can make it absurdly large. For the most part, the 1x are going to size themselves to the text that's around them, but you may find places like in the footer or other places where you want to use these that it might be more useful to resize them up than to set the font size that much bigger. We can also do brands. So if we wanted to do something like FA Twitter, and notice that I changed this FA from S, which was solid, to B for brands. Then we're getting the Twitter symbol instead. So that can be useful for creating social icons if you need. Most of the social sites are supported there. But let's go back to Paintbrush, and I'll show you one last thing. There's some behavior ones. And one that I use quite a bit is called spin. And in this case, you'll get it, but it will have an animation to it or it will just spin. And we'll use this later when we're looking at loading icons. This can be really useful to show some animation while some data is loading. But let's go back and get rid of that spin because, of course, that looks silly there. Let's apply this in one other place. Back here in the contact, I like to put these icons into the submit buttons. Back in the browser, if you remember, our submit button looks like this, and I'd love to just put a little icon there to give it a little more push about what this sending message is going to do. Now, because this is an input type of submit, there's no way to really inject because there's no child container. But what we can do is actually make this into a button, but keep the type submit. So it's still going to act like a submit button. But in this case, then we can end it with a button tag, which of course means that we can put send message here. Let's save that and just make sure it works. So we're right back here. Send message is still looks exactly the same. And if we inspect it, we can see it is a button, but that type submit is still there. And of course, when we send a message, it still works just like it did before. What we'd really like to do is go ahead and just put that little icon in here. And again, it's an I tag, and the I tag just has a class, and in this case, we're going to use the solid icons again. This time, we're going to use an envelope. There's the envelope, there's the send message, and of course, I didn't put the space in between, so it looks a little weird. And because we're getting pretty good IntelliSense, I can actually use a couple of these different envelope icons as well. Let me just go to the contact page so I don't have to resubmit it every time. And there we can see an open envelope or the square envelope. But I think we'll leave it at regular envelope and be done with it. So you can see we're using the icons in a couple of places, and I tend to use them a lot in buttons to sort of help push the idea of what we're trying to do. So there's an icon that sort of says the same message about it. And Font Awesome is a great way to add those icons without having to go through the work of actually figuring out where to download images and hope they size right and do all that other work, or even creating image sprites. So I've introduced Bootstrap as a comprehensive CSS and JavaScript framework. We've talked about some of the metaphors that we're going to use, like headers and buttons and cards, for building your site in an attractive way without necessarily needing to get designers involved. It's important, though, that you don't just take everything out of the box. You want to further skin or change the look and feel of your site so it doesn't look like every other Bootstrap site out there. So up next, we're going to start using database access using Entity Framework Core.